Hello, my name is Jeff Heath. I'm going to start in this segment talking about my biography as a field worker. I was one of very few linguistics undergraduate majors. I graduated in 1971 from Harvard College. I think there were four linguistics majors in my graduating class. I'm quite sure I was the only one who declared as a major on arrival as a freshman. And the first fieldwork opportunity I had came toward the end of my undergraduate years and into my first year as a graduate student in linguistics at the University of Chicago. And that's because I happened to run into a gentleman who was from Mississippi, a member of the Mississippi Choctaw tribe. And I was interested in languages, and we agreed that I would go down there and do a little bit of work over the summer. This is around 1971, and then into, I think, 72. And so I took the bus down there. That's a long way from New England to Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I got there. I had very little money. I rented a room in the old Benwald Hotel there for $15 a week, and I hitchhiked every day out to the Choctaw communities, which were scattered around the city itself. And I did what I could as a fledgling field worker, having very little training in field work, but being equipped with a good old UHER, that's UHER, reel-to-reel 5-inch reel tape recorder, which was the machine of choice at the time, and a lot of notebooks. And later on, I made a lot of cassette recordings. Well, I only published 2 short papers on simple grammatical issues based on the Choctaw work. I did make a lot of recordings, and those are now being archived at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was my funding source at the time. And so that work is of some value. But in terms of my biography, the main thing was that later on, a couple of years into my graduate work at University of Chicago, as I had been getting ready to pursue my Arabic studies by going to Egypt for a summer study program, having done Arabic as an undergraduate and into graduate work, the phone rang, and it turned out that in Australia they had suddenly had a new Labour government for the first time in some decades, and they had greatly increased funding for research on Australian Aboriginals, including languages. And they desperately needed field workers to sign up for 3-year fellowships. Now, they preferred people who had graduated so that they would be postdocs, but they were willing to consider someone who was in the middle of graduate study. And I had very little time to think about it or decide, but I decided, what the hell, I'll do it. So I canceled my Arabic summer study program, and next thing I knew, I was on a plane to Australia to spend 3 years doing field research, knowing absolutely nothing about Australian languages, knowing nothing about Aboriginal people, and knowing no anthropology, which, as it turned out, was something that you had to have to do any kind of research with traditional Australian Aboriginals. So I end up going to Numbulwar Mission, which is where they sent me. The prominent linguists, by the way, at the time in Australia were Bob Dixon, who was actively organizing field research by other people as well as his own, and also Michael Silverstein, who was my contact at Chicago, the contact between Dixon and me. and also Ken Hale of MIT, who had done a lot to get people interested in Australian Aboriginal languages. Well, anyway, they sent me to work on Nungabuyu, which is spoken in Arnhem Land, on the eastern coast of Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory. Now, it wasn't easy to get there. There's only one flight a week. Only way to get in there at the time was by air, and there was one flight a week. And I got there, and it was a mission, and a very isolated one. There was a trailer there, what they call a caravan in Australia, and it had been left there after a previous field worker had used it, an anthropologist. And in the 3 or 4 years since he had departed, there was a large tree had fallen on it, and then there were a couple of rainy seasons where it had gotten soaked and very moldy. And then eventually they fixed the roof, but it was still pretty difficult to live in. So I lived in this little box basically for the better part of 3 years, with all the mold and with the heat and so forth. And I did what I could as a field worker, not knowing much of anything about those languages or about how to do field work. So I did know that you want to do texts. I'd had enough exposure to American Indian linguistic research to know that texts were very important, and I started recording texts and doing a regular elicitation with a native assistant. And after a year of that, I was still really in the dark about the language. I really had a lot of problems figuring out. It had a very complicated morphology, very complicated morphophonemics, so very little was transparent about the morphology, and I had difficulty with vowel length, which is very subtle and it isn't what you usually think of as vowel length, and in general I just had a lot of problems. So after 9 months in the field, I came back to the capital city and to the Institute building and did what I could to organize my material. And then I went back for another 9 months. And during the second year, things started to click. I started to figure things out eventually after a lot of marination. And, things started to go pretty well, and I started to be able to transcribe text with a little bit more ease, and I ended up with about 7 hours of transcribed text. Probably would have done a better job of eliciting interesting texts if I had to do it over again, but I did get a lot of myth narratives and so forth, and some commentaries on regular everyday activities, food gathering, and so forth. So I ended up with a pretty good corpus, and I published a text volume, a dictionary, and a grammar, I believe in that order. Now I did the text first because I had decided, because I was having so much trouble with elicited material, that the only way for me to do it was to do it as a corpus analysis. That is, put the corpus together, publish it, and then use that as the touchstone for the grammar and the dictionary. So when the grammar finally came out, it was a very long grammar, many hundreds of pages, and I had to type it all myself on the old IBM Selectric typewriter. And if you made a couple mistakes, you had to throw that page away and start all over again. So that was laborious. But I finally got it done. Now what I decided to do, since I had this large textual corpus already published, I decided to make the grammar essentially a concordance-based grammar, or a corpus-based grammar, meaning that instead of making a statement about grammar and then one or two illustrative examples, I would make the statement about the grammar, and then I would have a long list, an exhaustive list of all the occurrences of that phenomenon or that word or whatever in the text collection, listing them by text number and section number. And I did this, so actually if you look at the grammar, just open it to a random page, you're probably not going to see, in the examples you're going to see just large lists of textual references by section, by text and section number. Similarly, the dictionary had rather brief definitions, usually with no examples, but with references to multiple textual occurrences. Now, in many ways, this way of designing a grammar text dictionary collection was ahead of its time. It was something that would make a lot of sense now, 40 years later, with computers and the ability to go back and forth between text and lexicon and grammar. In those days, it was somewhat revolutionary, and the works didn't really go over too well because, for one thing, you had to actually have copies of the text volume and the dictionary volume and the grammar volume all in front of you, and they rather quickly went out of print, and so there were very few people who were ever able to do that, to have a large table in front of them with the things set out. But now, with all of those works electronically available through Language Description Heritage Library or through my own deposits in Deep Blue at University of Michigan Library, all of those are now available online, so you can actually put them up on a large computer screen or any computer screen and toggle back and forth between text and grammar and dictionary. So the nice thing about it is that you can get all of the occurrences of a phenomenon from the text collection instead of just one or two that were selected by the grammar writer. So that was an interesting experience. Now, I was there for a total of 3 years, and including 1 year after I came back and finished my PhD at Chicago. So I was there for 3 out of a 4-year period, basically, from about middle of 72 to middle of 76, I think, or 77, I guess. And I also had a chance to work on some other languages. In fact, when things weren't going very well for the analysis of Nungabuyu, I would just drop it, put it aside, and if there was a speaker had showed up in that mission from another language, I would drop what I was doing and work with him or her for a month. And that went on. Ended up working on about 5 other languages, I think it was. Warndarang, Mara, Ritarangu, Thual, and Ngundi, and a little bit of a couple other languages. Now, of those, Warndarang was one where I worked with the last speaker. It was a very old man, and I got enough material from him to write a short grammar with a little bit of text and a decent basic vocabulary. And then he died, and then that project was over. But I felt pretty good about salvaging something from one language. The other languages I worked on were not in absolute immediate danger of extinction, but I did do full grammars of Ngundi and Mara in particular, and Ritarangu, and enough on Thual to publish a volume on kinship texts. All right, so I spent a lot of time after I came back from the field writing these things up, especially the Nungabuyu grammar, which was very laborious. But when I did come back, this time as an assistant professor at Harvard, I went back to my Arabist roots, the work that I had interrupted in 1972 in order to go to Australia to take that serendipitous opportunity. So summers and the occasional semester off, I went to Morocco, which is the place of the various Arabic speaking countries I'd visited, was the one that struck me as most interesting. So I went there and started working on special projects. I didn't have to do a grammar, didn't have to do a dictionary, didn't really have to do text collections because there were works of those types already available, at least for some variety of or other of Moroccan Arabic. So I was able for the first time to really do targeted projects. The first one was language contact. So I was interested in how Moroccan Arabic adopts historically Spanish and then French, and then more recently even some English borrowings, how they nativize these into fluently spoken Moroccan Arabic, and also how they handle borrowings, if that's the correct word, from the diglossic superordinate, which is literary Arabic, which is very different from Moroccan Arabic. So it was very interesting to look at the different ways those are brought in, especially the verbs. There were some very interesting results in terms of how French or Spanish verbs are brought in and nativized. The second project I did was a phonological study of Moroccan Arabic, basically just the mainstream Koine dialect, not anything else. And that focused on the ablaut system, which I found very interesting, how you map input forms onto output templates. So for the nouns, it would be the plurals and diminutives. And for the verbs, it would be going from perfective to imperfective or vice versa, and various derivational devices. So I did a detailed study about how that works based on a model where the input form is mapped onto an output template by basically having selected parts of it, particularly consonants, sucked out and copied onto the template. So that was an interesting project with a lot of depth. And then the third project, which was the really time-consuming one, was going all over Morocco, which has all kinds of different Arabic dialects of different vintages, reflecting different migrations, going back to the 8th century, and then some much later migrations of Arabian Bedouin and so forth. So a tremendous variety of dialects, old urban dialects, dialects spoken up in the mountains, and so forth. So it was a big job to just get basic information, a few key lexical items and some basic grammatical variables, and I had to go all over Morocco to do that. Now, unfortunately, in those days, there was a war going on in the south of the country, or just south of it, between Morocco and the Polisario rebels, because Morocco was annexing the former Western Sahara. So in the southern areas, especially the oases of southern Morocco, I didn't go into the Western Sahara, but just the traditional Morocco. And but even there, it was a militarily dangerous area, and very tight security, and it was very difficult for an investigator to go in there, even to gather harmless dialect information from speakers in the oases. And so what I did have permission from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do my research, but I did not have all of the province by province permissions that theoretically you're supposed to have from the Interior Ministry, which they never got around to doing. So I would go into one of these places in the south and get off the bus and go hang out in a cafe as a tourist, and make friends with somebody, and then see if we could do a 1 or 2 hour dialect questionnaire. And I would do that. Just how do you say, dog? How do you say dogs? And on, and various variables that were known to be dialectally sensitive. And usually by the time I'd finished, after an hour or two, there were some people that had come around, started looking on, and I had a pretty good idea that they were spies, and so I would wrap things up, have my lunch, and take a bus out of town. And then a few months later, I would come back to the same place and repeat the process. So the idea was to have material from 2 or 3 local speakers for each community. Now, it certainly wasn't very sophisticated social linguistic methodology, but it was the best that could be done under the circumstances. I also went to Israel. I made contacts with some professors at Hebrew University and University of Haifa, who were extremely helpful in arranging for me to make contact with Moroccan Jews who spoke Moroccan Judeo-Arabic, but who had left Morocco in most cases in 1951. So that would have been about 30 years before my fieldwork. And I was able to go, for example, spend a month in a settlement community near the Lebanese border called Shlomi, where they had a large number of Moroccans from all different parts of Morocco speaking various Moroccan Judeo-Arabic dialects. So that was very interesting, and I got at least basic material. Usually about an hour is what the individual people would give me. But I got some reasonably useful material, and so I was able finally to publish a book on Jewish and Moroccan dialects of Jewish and Muslim dialects of Moroccan Arabic, which I think is the only work of its kind. All right, so as a North African Arabist, I was also interested in other varieties outside of Morocco, including especially the Hassaniya Arabic, that is represents one of these Bedouin migrations, and it was across the southern part of the Sahara into southern Algeria, northern Mali, and especially Mauritania. So I got a fellowship that allowed me to do a month in Mauritania, a month in Tunisia, and a month in Mali in order to expand my knowledge of Arabic dialects of the area. And the one that, of those 3 places, the one that struck me as a place that I wanted to go back to was Mali. So I went to, in 1986, I had, that month was spent in Timbuktu. And I stayed there. I was working with Arabic speakers, but I stayed with the Songhai family. And it turns out that in Timbuktu, about 80% of the people are Songhai, and 10% Arab, and 10% Tamashek or Tuareg. And I came back one more time to Mali, I think in 1989, to continue my work on the Hassaniya Arabic, but I also started working on the local Songhai varieties. And so I made a transition about that time, about 89 or 90, from studying mostly Maghrebi Arabic to studying Songhai. So this was the first sub-Saharan black African languages that I'd ever worked on, having had no training whatever in sub-Saharan African linguistics. So I began coming back year after year, at least for the summer and sometimes for a free semester, to continue work on Songhai languages. Well, there are 2 main ones along the Niger River in Mali, one in Timbuktu, and environments, one in Gao and the environment. And so I worked on both of those and finished grammar text dictionary collections for those. I also became interested in the dialect spoken in Hungary, which is on an isolated mountain well to the south of the Niger River. And when trouble broke out in the far north, so it was not possible to go to Gao or Timbuktu any longer. I actually focused on the language, the Songhai language of Hungary, and also the variety spoken in Jenne, which is even farther south, which is close to that of Timbuktu. So I kept working on those Songhai languages. I also discovered another Songhai language that hadn't been known to the academic literature, which I called Tondi Songwai Kini, or Mountain Songhai language, abbreviation TSK. I discovered that in a village spoken on a different mountain a little farther south, not far from Douentza. So I had a lot to do with Songhai. It took a number of years to work out. The most difficult of those was the language of Homburi. It was the first real tonal African language that I had worked on, since the Songhai of Timbuktu and the Songhai of Gao had lost their tone, so there were no special difficulties about working on those languages. But Homburi was tricky because it has only two tone levels, high and low, but a lot of combinations and a lot of tone sandhi and a lot of subtle tonal distinctions in alienable versus inalienable possession and a lot of things like that that I was quite unprepared for. And so that's another language that really bamboozled me for a long time. I would work on it for a while, and then I'd throw my hands up and do something else for a while, and then later come back to it. And now, almost really 25 years later, I'm still tinkering with the language of Homburi, still working on finishing up the text volume, having belatedly published the grammar and the dictionary. All right, so at some point I'm basically done with the Songhai languages of Mali. There are Songhai languages in the Republic of Niger and a couple of urban pockets in Benin, and I visited those areas, but I was not able, or I guess I chose not to spend a great deal of time on them. I'll leave them to other people. So what I decided to do was to keep working in Mali, in the same general area where I had been working on Songhai, and just move south to the next language family which was there, which is Dogon. Now the Dogon languages, there are probably 80 locally named varieties of them, and we can sort of group them into about 20 or 22 languages, depending on how you make the language dialect distinction. And I looked around, there's basically nobody working on them. There were no serious reference grammars. There were a couple out of the 20 languages. There were maybe two that had pretty good missionary grammars, but without the tones, and which is deadly for tonal African languages. So I sensed an opportunity, and I got some funding to work on one of the languages, Jumsai, out of a base in Douentza, which is at the northern end of the Dogon country. And I worked on that and did a little survey work on a couple of other languages nearby. And it turned out to be very interesting. The Jumsai language turns out to have very interesting, very different kind of tonal system. Just two levels like Songhai, but without the tone sandhi, instead with the kind of tonal ablaut, which we call tonosyntax, which was very interesting on its own terms. And I could see there were a bunch of other Dogon languages that badly needed work, so I began trying to recruit other people to come and join me in doing this. And this is at a time when it was starting to become possible to get grants for endangered language research. So I first brought in a Dutch linguist named Stefan Elders. He was actually going to work on Buggy, which is a language isolate spoken in the Dogon area. And he was there for about a year, and then he got sick and tragically died in the field at a time when I was back in the U.S. So that project didn't start very well. However, we picked up the flag, so to speak, and kept going. And some other people joined us, and we developed a much better infrastructure with a real home base and a vehicle and a project assistant to avoid the kind of thing that had happened before. And over several years, we had a number of people come in, including Laura McPherson, who worked on the Tomoso language and finished a grammar and has gone on to be an assistant professor at Dartmouth and is doing various projects of her own in Burkina Faso and in Melanesia. Another young project member was postdoc Abby Hantgen, who had been a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dogon area and came back with a PhD in linguistics or as a PhD student in linguistics at Indiana to work on her original Dogon language and also on the Buggy that Stefan Elders had left unfinished. And we had a few other people, including a couple of Russians, who had come and worked on individual Dogon languages. And we're still plugging away. Some of them are still coming back. Also, Steve Moran, who, in addition to being our website designer and administrator, our project website administrator, has also been doing field work on one of the Dogon languages. Now, after all this, that was like 2005, we got started, or I did, on Dogon, and now it's 2018, and we're still plugging away on the last few Dogon languages that remain to be described, but we've knocked down more than half of them in terms of a decent size, book length, a reference grammar, and some supporting materials. So we've gone a long way toward building a foundation for Dogon linguistics. Now, the other language in that area that I mentioned is Buggy. That's an interesting language isolate. It's spoken in a valley that cuts into the rocky plateau where the Dogon are, but they're in complete isolation. There's really nothing behind them or to the left or the right other than the cliffs going up and just rocky plateau up above them, which is uninhabitable. So they're very isolated. They have an outlet into the plains, where they can come out and go to the markets along the highway. But to this day, they're still kind of isolated in these cul-de-sac valleys. Now, their language has been a mystery. Almost no work had been done on it before we got there. Roger Blench had visited, spent a couple days there, and did a very informative couple-page or 3-4 page brief description on his website, basically trying to get somebody to go in there and do a serious job on it. So after Stefan Elders, after Abby, who had taken in 2012, I believe, had taken another a postdoc, I was able to go in and complete that work. And as we speak, in April 2018, finally our Buggy grammar is coming out, is being published, I think, this week in Germany at the Mutan Grammar Library. So we're very proud of that. Buggy is also interesting. The language and the Bangande people, as they're called, are also interesting because of their isolation and their fact that they're linguistically unrelated to other language families. And we were fortunate enough to enlist a young genetics postdoc named Hiba Babikir from Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany. He was actually a Sudanese native and citizen, but we were able to get her to come down to Mali and to get genetic samples from a couple of Buggy villages and also from several of the Dogon villages in the region and from 2 Songhai communities, Hombori and also the village where the TSK language is spoken, and also from one Bozo village in the plains just outside where the Buggy speaking people come out, and one Fulfulde village. So she now has a very good genetic samples from several ethnic groups in that area, which are the first decent its first decent genetic material to come from that area, and so we're expecting considerable progress in the study of the demography, the historical demography of those areas. But it does appear from the preliminary results that the Buggy-speaking people, the Bangande, really are genetically isolated within the context of West Africa. All right, in 2012, there was another rebellion in the north of Mali, this time much more serious than the earlier ones. It started out as an independence movement, and then it morphed into a jihadist movement. So the Tuaregs, basically, and Arabs in northern Mali took control of the major cities in the north, Timbuktu and Gao and Kidal, and they controlled the area down to and including Douentza, where we had our original base when we were starting to work on Dogon. And it made it difficult for us even to work out of Mopti Severe, where we had moved after several years in Douentza down there to take advantage of the better facilities that you have in Severe than farther north. And so we had been working out of Severe, but even that became too hot. So we jumped into a vehicle, and myself and my Malian assistant and a couple of language informants, and we took off. And we headed to Burkina Faso, the next country over, and we drove till we got to the city of Bobo-Dioulasso in the southern part of Burkina, and we basically laid down some roots there. Now, initially, we used it as a base to continue our work on Malian languages. So I had 3 junior project members who wanted to keep working on their Malian language, and so we brought more Malian native speakers down to our house in Bobo-Dioulasso, and the junior project members rejoined us there. And so at one point we had 8 Malians, myself and 3 other expat linguists, all living and working in the same house. So it was a little bit crowded, but we managed to keep the work going without much of a break. Now we've continued to maintain a base in Bobo-Dioulasso. So I now have 2 bases: the old one in Mopti Severe in Mali, and the new one in Bobo-Dioulasso. And one of the things that happened when we were in Bobo-Dioulasso is we looked around and we saw there were some interesting languages in that area, including a couple of endangered languages. One in particular, the Chieffo language, or one of 2 Chieffo languages. That's usually spelled Tiefo. And there were 2 languages which we call Chieffo N and Chieffo D for the names, abbreviation of the villages where they're spoken. And Chieffo N was really down to a couple people. In fact, it had been written off by other linguists as already dead. But we found a couple of very old speakers, and so we began working on them on a kind of a crash basis. So that work involved Abby Hantkin again. It also involved a graduate student in linguistics in Burkina named Aminata Ouattara, and I did what I could. And then later, when Abby left, I took over that project, and I'm still working on the second Chieffo language. The first one, the one that was down to 2 speakers, is Chieffo N, and we've published a short grammar of that, and we're now working on Chieffo D, myself and Aminata in particular. There was also another language there called Jelkunan, which I worked on, and we've also been encouraging other young linguists, even if not directly part of our project, to come there and be hosted by us and work on one of the many other languages that are spoken in that area. So we've had one graduate student from my university, University of Michigan, who has gone there to work on Bobo. That'd be Kate Sherwood, and another person who was one of Laura McPherson's students at Dartmouth and then graduated and came to spend a year with us. That would be Nate Severance, who's now a graduate student at University of Oregon. So nowadays I'm continuing to do my own work in Mali, finishing up on Dogon Languages and also working on starting a new project on Bozo languages, while also shuttling back and forth between there and Burkina to work on the Chieffo D. There's also an endangered language of Cote d'Ivoire that I and a couple of Ivorian colleagues and one graduate student are going to be working on this coming year, called Pere, or sometimes written Mbre, M-B-R-E, which is a language that's down to, we think, about 50 speakers in northern Cote d'Ivoire. So we're doing things like that are opportunistic, that have to do with languages that must be studied very quickly, the Jalkuna and the Chieffo and the Pere. But we're also hoping to get younger people in there to make southwestern Burkina kind of a go-to place for a study of Mande languages, for study especially of Gur languages, and one or two others that are in that area. So that's about where we stand at this point, so I'll cut this segment off.